All right, everybody, I'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to the third annual State of Policing and Public Mental Health panel event. I want to first take a second to acknowledge it is Veterans Day. So I want to thank all of our current and past service members who provide so we can have open discussions such as these. My name is Brandon Martinez. I am a philosophy and psychology student here at MSU Denver, as well as the ambassador for research and development for the Institute of Public Service. Today's meeting is about understanding how institutions serve the public and how we can all play a role in making public service more effective and compassionate. So once again, I'm grateful to everybody in attendance, both online and on site. And I'm especially grateful for our panelists, Dr. Andrea Borrego, Chair of the Criminal Justice and Criminology Department, Sam Reagan's LCSW and Denver Co-Responder Program Crisis Intervention and Response Unit, or CIRU. And then Jason Melender, Chief of the Auraria Police Department. I'll ask you all now, again, introduce themselves. You just say your position, what led you to your current position, and what's the favorite thing about your field that you get to do. Dr. Borrego,
Sure. Good evening or afternoon. I'm not really sure the time of day right now. So yes, Andrea Borrego. I am chair professor in criminal justice and criminology. I started teaching here a decade ago. So I got a chance to teach in grad school and loved it, and decided this is where I'm going to go. Never on my radar to become chair, but enjoying that because I feel like I can be a better advocate for our whole department, faculty, staff, and students. My favorite thing is everything.
Yes.
Doing things like this, interacting with students, teaching in the classroom, and just getting to have dialogue.
Great. Hi everyone, I'm Sam Ravens. I'm the Associate Director of Criminal Justice Services at WellPower, which is the City and County of Denver's Community Mental Health Center. I oversee our co-responder programs, our STAR program, which is our alternative response program, and what we call our court-based programs, which are competency diversion, competency restoration, probation, local case management, and some other specialty case management that are criminal justice facing. I've been with WellPower for 13 years and have been doing work in the criminal justice field, specifically with co-response for the past 10. Favorite thing about this, I also love teaching and presenting, but I think one thing I love about it is no day is the same. And as a person who works in crisis and criminal justice, I can't stand monotony. So I really like that things are very different.
All right, I'm Jason Mollenbaum, the Chief of Police for the Auraria Campus Police Department. I've worked with the department for over 24 years. I'm Metro Denver alone, so I'm very attached to this campus. Our police department has several divisions. We have the whole division with the officers wearing uniform. We have a dispatch division. We have our own communication center, if you didn't know that. Also, we're a division, which is multiple point of emergency. So altogether, with a lot of support for our community when we need it. Which unfortunately sometimes we do. Our favorite part about this job, other than the buying clothes, again, supporting the educational mission of our community. Helping people develop themselves and get opportunity. I think it's awesome.
All right, perfect. So I see a couple returning faces. For those who this is their first panel event, the first time we hosted it, we talked about the ideas such as abolishing the police, root causes of crime, key principles in modern policing, and the role that STAR plays in reducing police presence. During the second panel event, we had a broader perspective and talked more about systematic changes, what are some socioeconomic and racial disparities in getting access to mental health care, and personal well-being for those in law enforcement and STAR and other social work programs. For today's panel event, there are three themes I want to cover. The first is critical thinking. The second is education as a way for social progress. And the third is clear and relevant, accessible action, really highlighting on that last one. Something I've noticed over the last 3 years is how much interest there are in these fields, although but they don't always seem very accessible and easy to break into if you do want to get involved in some way. So I emphasize this is a dialogue for you all, Any question, comment, concern, or disagreement is greatly encouraged to be voiced. And this is about civic engagement, which means there are probably going to be some differing opinions. So I just ask that everybody remains curious and passionate towards each other, because that will lead to a more meaningful outcome. So while some of the questions may be directed towards just one panelist, I invite all the panelists to comment on each question. We'll open the floor for a Q&A during the last 30 minutes of our scheduled time. Please write down any questions you might have or type it in the chat, and then I'll read it during the Q&A section. And I'd like to give our audience members actually a moment real quick to voice their thoughts when they hear the name of the event, the state of policing and mental health, or, our three themes: education, social progress, critical thinking, and accessible action. If there's any thoughts at all that pop up into your mind, feel free to just blurt it out. There's extra credit if you do. This is little incentive. Yeah, of course. Or you could also ask the panelists if you have any thoughts, maybe specific to our themes, because I know they're different and more intentional this year. If there's anything that comes to mind right away.
I think critical thinking is a really important point, especially when we're thinking about how media is shaping a lot of perceptions and views. Sometimes we tend to get caught in echo chambers instead of taking a step back and critically thinking about something. Why do you think that way? And then going out and finding actual evidence-based practices, scientific inquiry, publications, as opposed to just say, I believe in that, therefore I'm just going to keep following that. Push yourself. Why do you think something? And how can we think about it or approach things differently? Oh, it's what we're doing for you.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of that, I think with education part of it, I think right down.
Education is progress.
Education is progress.
Yeah, so it's progress.
Yeah. So thank you. I think you're taking notes. And it's old one. Yeah, I think education piggybacks off of critical thinking of it's education in terms of formalized education, right? Which can be great for individuals and also can pose a challenge for some in many different facets. And so how do we educate ourselves in other ways in order to really understand and be a critical thinker in terms of what's happening in society, what are we doing to improve it, what are additional ways that we can educate ourselves in order to improve, and how do we educate ourselves in a holistic way, right? We're not just educating ourselves in a one-sided manner, which again relates to critical thinking. We're really educating ourselves holistically so we can really make a decision. I also think that we're in a, as a LCSW, and the person who hires licensed clinical social workers, we're also in a place where we're not seeing as many people go into higher education, and not as many people go into the field. And so we're in a really interesting point where how do we continue to do what we're doing when the formalized education seems to have drifted into people just going into it less and accessing those higher degrees that have historically always been required to get into the field and to pose a huge barrier for individuals who would make incredible clinicians. You just can't get past those barriers.
Just to piggyback off on what Bolton said, for policing, one of our biggest challenges right now is finding people that want to enter this profession of police officers. Part of the perception over the last few years and the negativity most of that is unfortunately not necessarily reflective of how most police officers do their job. And that has put us in a position where we're really struggling to find people that want to serve their communities and do this very difficult, challenging occupation, especially when they don't get support.
All right, perfect. So something that comes to mind for me, at least, because thinking back to how this event all first started, is I had a friend who used to be my level-headed friend. I like to think. But then when it came to conversations like these, he simply wasn't willing to talk about it. So I believe events like these are the antidote to black and white thinking and the first step to successful action. So let's get started. First question for Dr. Borrego. How, and this is kind of echoes what you've already talked about, but how can education, whether through schools, community spaces, or media, play a role in changing how communities and law enforcement respond to the mental health crisis?
I think one of the first parts is one, it allows for dialogue. So something like this is really great. Like we're inspiring it, and this is the expectation of how we come together. And two, I was kind of thinking a lot about it. It's a very multifaceted question because it could go a lot of, like, I can look at it from the classroom perspective. I can look from being in the community. I used to serve on the community advisory board for the sheriff's department here in Denver, and that brought a lot of different community leaders, educators, practitioners all together. And what I think is really important is like creating those spaces in the first place. When we work in silos where we can't have the dialogue and sharing of ideas and testing of, do you think that's correct, and or how can I do something differently? And we, in our departments, so our faculty, half of our full-time faculty have worked as practitioners, and the other half like focus really on research. And then a lot of our part-time faculty have worked as practitioners as well. And we value those, that balance of ideas, because you have to acknowledge there's always something to learn. Academics can learn something from practitioners, and practitioners can learn something from academics. When you come into a spot and just say, no, this is what I know, you stop the conversation, you stop dialogue, you stop learning. And we have to be able to like have fruitful conversations. I spent 5 years on that advisory board, and I really appreciated it. And saw 3 different sheriffs, 4, throughout that time, which was really interesting. And it wasn't until the current sheriff that was like, hey, how do I do better in the jails? And asked me to serve on the search committee to hire the chief of mental health services, which I've never existed in jails before. And then she was like, let's do some work. Let's do some research. Let's talk about what this looks like. And so my colleague, Dr. Fontenot in the department, and I have interviewed sheriff's deputies looking to interview clinicians and understand like what does crisis look like in jails, and what is that responding? How do they work together for 2 people that were hired to do very different things, but also working towards the same goal in a way. So that's a really big roundabout way of saying opportunities for dialogue that allow education to happen in both organic but also very intentional ways is important. And kind of touched on community. I can go on and on. I feel like this is, again, really big question, but don't want to dominate that. So I'll leave it at that.
Anything that you'd like that, or?
Yeah.
That was the answer to end all.
Yeah.
Probably. Yeah, I really like that point about the importance of not working in a silo, and that kind of more community, interdisciplinary work, which is really important. Next question for Sam Ravens is, which models for non-police crises responses prove most effective in reducing harm and improving outcomes compared to police-led responses? And how can communities adapt or expand on these models locally?
I think you actually have to have both in your community, because police absolutely serve a purpose in our community in terms of keeping people safe. Whereas our alternative response model isn't taking calls that police should be on, right? So when we talk about, and I can talk about my specific models, but when we talk about how they respond, they're responding to what we describe as low-level, low-acuity calls. So instances where there's not going to put anyone's safety at risk, right? I'm not put my own safety at risk as a responder, meaning someone doesn't have a weapon, for instance. That's like this situation to describe. And I can't go hands-on, right? Like if someone really needs additional support in that way, I'm not going to be doing that. That's not my training, right? Nor is that my job, nor is that what I signed up for, right? And so if we allow people to have an alternative response model, which we do, which takes on those calls that police don't need to be at. They're probably calls that don't even need to come to the police to begin with, right? And our society has set up the system, which is one, for people to be able to respond. And we've always had this typical response of police, sheriff, fire, MS, right? So they're taking away those calls that don't really fit into any of those categories. There are still mental health calls that come through that need those categories, that need those individuals to respond. And so to say, how do we, like, an alternative response model, I don't know if I'm answering the question correctly, but, to just have an alternative response model doesn't make sense. In my opinion, you need to have a marriage of both, because there are two different types of calls. Our police call responders are able to deal with a high acuity, high risk situations. So they're able to go into calls because they have officers with them, where there might be a firearm involved. There might be a casualty situation. There might be a barricade. There might be a person on the side of the building, right? And so we work together. And the way we work in Denver is because we work for the same agency, we're able to communicate with each other. So we can say, hey, today this person really needs a call response. They need to have an officer with them. And then tomorrow they might say, hey, this person's actually doing a lot better. They engage in some of the resources. They can actually have an alternative response, respond out loud. Right? And so we can really work together. Tell me the rest of the question, sorry.
I know it's a big first question. I believe the rest is how can communities adapt or expand response locally?
Thank you. So in terms of like communities adapting, so Denver is really interesting, right? It's city and county in one, and so we can be really unique in our type of response. We're also a big city, right? We're a metropolitan city, and we have metropolitan concerns and issues in politics as a result. And so what we do in our model is absolutely not going to fit in other communities. We are not a rural community. We are not a mountainous community. We are not a community that relies on the next door community to have a response, right? We have everything in-house. And so the way we do it and the way we've adapted to Denver is critical in terms of Denver improving its social response. But what we do is not going to be the same for any other community. And so when we talk about how does another community adapt, they really have to figure out what is best for them, not only within their community members and what their community members want, right? That's the social work way. Ask people what they want, don't tell them what they need. And then say, what's our infrastructure and how can we accommodate both? And so when we do talk about these programs and how to implement them into other communities, it's the first thing we talk about. We talk about how it works for us, and we really make sure that we say, that might not be the case for you. How can you adapt what you've learned from us for your community?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point about the marriage of different services. So I think that a lot of people who kind of from the outside looking in, they'll see some news stories about, police did this or there's this shortcoming in this public service, and they think, oh, we need to start all over because of that. When oversight now seems to be about pointing out the bad, but not about highlighting the good. So I really like the point about the marriages of services rather than having one replace the other.
The news loves the bad story, because that's what makes news. The news doesn't love a good story, because, not to be blunt, but it does get us much conversion, right? And so all the good you're seeing and all the amazing work that we're doing in partnership with the police is not possible without our partnership with police, right? And the marriage isn't possible. In Denver, our co-responder program started first before our alternative response, and it really paved the way for our alternative response to get the boots off the ground really quickly, because we already have that infrastructure built in with dispatch, with the community, with the support systems like police, fire, and sheriff, and EMS. And so it's been really helpful. But yeah, the good story doesn't get reversed.
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah.
All right. For the law enforcement perspective now. So Chief Melunder, during the second panel event, I believe you said officers are required to complete about 40 hours of training on topics related to mental health. What improvements can be made to this training, and how can educational or community input inform these topics?
I think it's important to understand that historically, the police officers are catch-all, right? There's a problem, you just call the police, and the police are expected to respond to whatever that situation is and make it better. And that's sometimes can be a challenge because you don't know what you're addressing, how you're addressing it. And police officers are social workers. We are there to respond, resolve the situation, and then go to the next call. And so one of the issues is really having that long-term sustainable mental health service available. The reality is we might be able to solve an issue for a moment, but that's not going to prevent that person from worse or going right back into the same cycle without that prolonged help. And our society is really bad at providing those services, which is something I think the co-responder units are terrific at, because now there's at least a bridge where they can get prolonged help and help guide them to really a more sustainable way of living, and hopefully a healthier way where they're not needing to be have the police intervene. Our training is what's called a CIT course, which is a crisis intervention training for people that might be having a mental health situation. And it covers a variety of different topics and how to interact with them in a positive way. Because even with co-responders, even with the new developments, most likely it's going to be a police officer first ones, and it's going to have to deal with somebody that's having that crisis. And understanding why and training how to deal with them in a more productive and more positive way is critical to having a better outcome. The reality is you're not always going to have a better outcome though. Sometimes people are violent, sometimes people choose a course of action which isn't best for anyone. And so we have to respond to that as well. But having the ability to understand what's going on with the Canada situation, I think is just a significant benefit to the police officers after responding. What I think we do better, more training is always great. It's also expensive and it's difficult to find. And the reality is there's not a lot available.
I would add to that too, it's not like CIT training is 40 hours, right? Whereas like for co-responders, it's 4 years of college, 2 years of a master's degree. We require a license, so 2 years of additional clinical training, right? And then additional training about it, right? And so that's why we pair so well together, because all of their police training, we get like 8 hours of it, right? Because we're a balance. But I think to also deal with individuals who we're not trained to deal with, who have their own trauma, and therefore your experience of vicarious trauma as a result of theirs. It's not just educating officers. I mean, it is educating officers on what are these populations that you're dealing with. What is mental health? What is an intellectual and developmental delay? What is a co-occurring disorder, right? So really understanding that, but it's also giving space for officers to be able to deal with what they see every day, so that they, as clinicians, we say, anyone else until we help ourselves, right? And so we really encourage seeking support, seeking counseling, seeking whatever we need to seek to be able to have healthy coping skills and show up to work the next day to really show up for that person. And so I think on top of what I could add something to CIT, it wouldn't just be CIT, but it would also be adding some sort of additional support services for officers so that they can show up as their best selves, because no one can if they're not getting additional help outside after vicarious trauma every single day calling.
I also, as an aside, before I forget, I am seeing some people in chat saying they're having a little bit of an issue hearing, so just technical, just a little bit more. But I want to say on your two perspectives, it's really important because a big area when it comes to mental health resources is those public servants, for whether it's law enforcement, social workers, or other public servants, you're expected to give, and keep on giving, and why is doing that, why is there this going on? So it is also a big piece of the puzzle that I think is emphasized quite enough. All right, so next question for Dr. Borrego. Does it surprise you that there are some students, professors who want events like these to be limited in their promotion because of the uncomfortable subject matter? How do you respond to these concerns, and why do you think it's important to engage with difficult topics?
Not as surprising, I suppose. Being a criminal justice scholar, and particularly a policing use of force scholar, I've had to engage in a lot of uncomfortable topics over the years. But I think, kind of going back to what I said before, we rely on, we're human, so we like to be justified in the way we're thinking. So whether you do it consciously or unconsciously, you seek out people who are going to confirm your own biases. And it's really hard to sit here and question your own biases and say, what can I think? How can I think differently, or how can I approach this one way differently? And it's just we're people. We like to be right. I mean, how many of you wake up and be like, who can prove me wrong today? My guess is nobody, but I'm really surprised if you do. Kudos to you. I mean, even I have those things, and I have to take a step back and like, why do I have to be right now? And what I think we can all do is listen a little bit more, think about things a little bit more, be a little bit more calm, and even maybe slow in responses to what is so challenging. There's so much that we're consuming in the world today in a lot of different ways, essentially conflict in every aspect of our lives. And to even think about, like, take it down to like this other level, right? We're talking about a big thing, mental health crisis across cities and the country and all those things. But kind of as both of you were saying, like just as people and how we're managing everything we're consuming every day and taking it down and to think about like I've always said this, public safety is a public health concern. And that means people matter. Every person matters, despite no matter what their role is in any way. And so I think we need to stop thinking in terms of like us versus them, but like goals. What are we working towards? What are the solutions that we're thinking about? What is it that in that sense, we're all probably working towards a very similar goal. We're just using different ways or have a different understanding of how to get there. So I think, again, having these conversations is really important. I mean, we all sit here and we probably agree on a lot of things, but we also probably disagree on things too. But does that mean we don't have respect for each other and can't work together or work together? Different approaches, but our end goal is reduction in crime, public safety, public health, reducing mental health crisis, reducing harm for people in crises, and promoting the well-being of individuals who have to take on this really hard work.
As well. Yeah.
One question I had is, I question the motivation of the person that asked that or wanted to say that, right? Because you're in college, you're here to learn, you're here to see different perspectives.
Absolutely.
And if you genuinely want to change the world, if you genuinely care about these topics, you need to really understand them. If you come out from a point of bias, you're going to have an incomplete response.
And change doesn't happen with easy conversation, right? So if people are saying like it's too hard, then like where is change going to happen, right? Like no changes happen through like, I don't know, like a very good, like, hey, you want to do this? Yeah, cool. Let's change the world, right? Like it's usually stemming from something really challenging and really scary, and you don't address that, then you're definitely not going to affect change.
Yeah, and I think those are all super important points because something I remember thinking a lot about when I made the first event is that it seemed that these are made out to be political issues when they're all people issues at the end of the day. It's easy to look at this and say, oh, I don't like police, or I don't like this, or I don't like whatever. And then that prevents you from really looking at that entire population as individual people who are also, in the same community, facing the same struggles. All right, so next question for Sam Ravens is, what oversight mechanisms have you found most effective in preventing harm and replicating success during mental health crises encounters? And how can these mechanisms be more forward-thinking rather than reactive?
Yeah, so I think it's twofold. One, I think it's the partnership, the relationship that you have with your responding party, right? Like we respond with fire, sheriff, police, EMS, Parks and Rec, and RTP, right? And so really having that relationship. But when you're talking about the person who's in the mental health crisis, the biggest thing is rapport building. Because I'm not going to listen to what someone wants me to do. That's probably kind of best if I don't trust them, right? And so the biggest thing we encourage our clinicians to do, no matter who they're responding with, is to build that genuine rapport, right? And to recognize that you might not be that person, right? If Chief and I responded and someone really was traumatized by the mental health system, which happens, I might not be the right person to build that rapport. That's okay, right? That's why we respond in partnership. They may really lean into Chief and trust Chief, and she's the one who's able to say, hey, how can we support you in that moment, right? So it's really about like setting your ego aside and really thinking about how I can build support trust with this person. And then we're also looking at verbal de-escalation, utilizing those skills every single time we contact someone, right? Our goal is to, reduce use of force, which I think for in Denver for co-responders with police, we're under 1.5% for reduce of forces when we are on scene with them, which is huge. I mean, low number, huge response, right? And so it's really using your verbal de-escalation skills to really figure out how do we get to the next step. And sometimes they work, and sometimes you use your verbal de-escalation skills and the situation changes, and so you may pivot into something else. But that's really our goal, is to never have that use of force, and it's proven by our numbers that we collect. I also think we really, when we're responding to people, we also need to be reminded of this person is in a crisis, and they might not. I'm not myself when I'm in crisis. How could I expect anyone else to be themselves, right? And so our reactions may be different, our thought processes may be different. How we see the world might be viewed differently, and so we really need to remember that. And then the one thing we also teach our responders too is when you're responding out in the community, you're typically, not always, sometimes you're responding in buildings or parks or whatever, right? But oftentimes we're responding to people's homes, right? And not for everyone, but oftentimes home can be a safe place for people, right? Sometimes home is not a safe place, and sometimes it is. And we're also responding, when we respond in someone's safe place, we're responding in a position of power and privilege. And we're also responding into someone's culture, right? Into their community. And so we really need to be mindful of how we respond, not just with our clinical skills of rapport building and verbal de-escalation, but how are we showing up and how are we being present to really look at the person as who they are holistically, where they're coming from, and how we can support them in their next step. Not what necessarily what we think is best, but what's their next step. And I think those have really, keeping all those things in mind have really helped reduce use of force, be able to get people to the next step in their, crisis journey, which is, I always say, like a 10 to a 9, right? We're not going to solve the problem today, but we want to get you one step towards stability. And then having partners that we trust, right? Because if we have to rely on each other. If I need to say, this person actually does have to go to the hospital, they do need a higher level of care, like, I'm not going to be the one who helps them get into an ambulance or helps them get into a police car for transport. Those are really our only two options in Colorado for transport. We're relying on my partner, right? And so we want to be able to make sure we're on the same page and work together and have trust, show that to the person, which means they're going to trust us more too.
I like that. Call step into the police car.
Yes.
And I think the rapport building is very important because when I was at the Denver AI Summit earlier this year, there's a lot of talk about how to restore trust in government and public sources again. And the way to do that isn't being legally and technically correct in your actions. It's about supporting and building up the dignity of constituents within the community. So they feel they can turn towards public servants and public services and government instead of, thinking, how am I going to be potentially mistreated versus shortcoming going to happen?
Yeah.
That way. All right. Next question for Chief Melender. So the current trend on a lot of our minds are the legal actions of ICE around the country. For those who equate the practices of law enforcement with ICE, describe how your work differs from ICE and how can public dialogue help clarify those differences to build community trust?
Absolutely. First off, ICE enforces federal immigration law, which is very different than what local police do. Local police do not engage in any type of immigration enforcement. In Colorado, has a law specifically prohibiting that. And even before the law, it's just not something that we do. But even prior to kind of the push and the concerns over ICE, our police department never has called ICE or worked with ICE or tried to engage in a way that would engage in immigration enforcement for our community because there's no need, right? As local police, our job is local law. It is keeping people safe, providing an environment that is supportive to them. And the reality is that misconception of what local police do compared to federal law enforcement does harm how people want to contact and get help when they need it. I never want to hear somebody was victimized and wouldn't call the police because they were afraid they were going to get deported or detained. The reality is that's not the case. We're here to support everyone. We want to make sure that people that need help get it.
Yeah, that's another reason why I think these conversations are more important than ever because some of the pushback I did receive from some professors and students were because, well, why are you promoting ICE? It's like, I'm not promoting ICE. There's a difference. And some people simply aren't aware of that. I wouldn't know that unless there were events such as these. So another question for Dr. Borrego. So what specific data and metrics reflect real progress for safer crisis responses? And who's responsible for defining what constitutes progress to ensure transparency and accountability?
A very big question again. Yeah, my colleague and I were chatting on the way here and trying to figure out. So in terms of data, well, before we even get to the data, we have to decide what we're going to measure and what outcomes we're actually looking for. And you ask, who does that fall on? Almost everybody. I mean, it's really hard to tease out. So I say that with, we have so many community groups that are advocating for the health and humanity of people and groups, and to them what is healthy and what's positive might look different than what we have in terms of what we've been talking about, right? Like use of force incidences, reducing the number of calls, and so there's both qualitative and quantitative data here, right? So the quantitative data is going to be our counts, and of course, we want to see a reduction in crime over time. But does that necessarily mean that communities are being helped? It really depends on how you're measuring the data. Are we seeing less calls for service because we're reducing crime, or are we seeing less calls for service because people are nervous, that people are scared to call the police for help, right? So are we actually seeing a reduction in crime? And so usually when we teach it, we call it, we talk about the dark figure of crime, and the way we illustrate it is the iceberg that took out the Titanic, right? You saw, like, we see the top of it, it's in all our textbooks, best way to illustrate it, but what took it out is the iceberg underneath it. It's what we don't know and what we can't measure. And so we try to get at it in a lot of different ways. Again, who does it fall on? I always say the first line of accountability are the public servants, the people that were hired to protect citizens, so that we should then be implementing ways to measure all these different things. However, we are human. There's a lot that happens. In the United States, there's 18,000 police departments. How we measure crime. And so I mentioned I'm police use of force researcher, and I worked with the Bureau of Justice Statistics as an intern and worked on their death in custody reporting program, right? So use of force that ended in death. It's a voluntary program. There have been researchers asking, we need to make this a mandatory thing. I called police departments. Hey, are you going to send us in your data? They said no. This is an unwarranted investigation into our department. And then some other departments were like, sure, here it is. Okay, how'd you collect it? I don't know, I searched the news. Right? So like, and this isn't it, you can look this up. So eventually the Research Triangle Institute went and did an analysis of the death in custody reporting program. It started death in custody reporting program started in 2005, and it's been going on. And they found out that yes, out of all the states, there is no standardized way to collect the data, right? And we're thinking about, like, even take Colorado, as you were saying, right? We're a metropolitan area, so we probably get a little bit more resources to collect data. Think of something like Fairplay. How do you think they're collecting data? It's probably not the same way. And again, so this is a bigger problem than just like, there are probably departments that want to do well, but again, understaffed. How do we get there? And okay, the federal government, right? So the FBI has been like, hey, let's do something a little bit better. So we have NIBRS, I'm not going to remember the acronym right now, NIBRS, Google it. There we go, thank you, National Incident-Based Reporting System. So they use a triangulation of data, right? So it is official data, but they also go out and they get coroner's reports, and then as well as media reports. So they're getting information from a lot of different places. So NIBRS is like, why don't we do that for use of force? it is still a voluntary program. And then they don't always collect from federal agencies. So we are missing data. And again, I'm mostly talking use of force data here. That's my expertise. I don't speak to everything else. So when you're doing that, it's, I think sometimes the question is not necessarily who, but how. What are we doing? And what are we using that data for? How is the outcome? No, it's not an unwarranted investigation. We should know, right? Like what's working. And then, so how are we collecting data and then what is working? And that's really important because, as Sam mentioned earlier, what works in one city or county doesn't work in another. What we have to do is we actually have to collect the data. We have to do the analysis. Why did it work? What can be transferred to other places? And then that's when you get a lot of other places like Center for Evidence-Based Practices, which is housed out of George Mason University. It's a website you can look up actual peer-reviewed papers by a lot of policing scholars across the world, and you can go look up, and they have this whole matrix in terms of like types of community, types of responses, those types of things. Then you also have like the Vera Institute. Did they do the Vera or Urban Institute that did a lot of the research into deer programs into co-responder models here in Colorado because this is a progressive program. And so a lot of this then was able to inform other communities that wanted to do this program. So then that's where we start to get down into the nitty gritty too, like a little bit more into the qualitative, and then what's working for the communities and what do the communities want. So trying to answer a very large question in a way that makes sense. So who's responsible? The people that are responsible for taking care of people. But what we need to remember is what it looks like as well. And so it's not always like we have to think about what's more important for also trying to solve the issues of social problems, which is very hard because there's many factors involved. And we can't do true experiments and just say, aha, I know X caused Y, therefore this is our intervention. Rather, we have a lot of correlation. Correlation does not mean causation, right? So it's a lot of trial and error. And I think that's then what gets to the issue of, do people really care? Are they really thinking of the community? And the thing is progress takes time and it's really hard. And the partnerships take time. It's important to have progressive leaders in these ways that are willing to work with each other because we don't have that everywhere. And so I would end there. I don't know if I'm answering, providing I might be offering more questions.
That's the goal of this panel. I don't think we're going to solve every single question everybody has about the public. If we do, great. Give me a job, I guess. Yeah, the idea of government that works slow and that takes patience, I think, is very important. If there's anything I learned from being a professional intern, it's that it does work very, very, very slow. But when it does work, it does really good work. All right. So when it does, fingers crossed. So next question for Sam Ravens. If someone here today wants to get involved in improving crisis response and community safety, what's one concrete step they can take right now, whether they're a student, faculty member, community member, or anybody?
It just depends on what capacity someone wants to change crisis response. I think if it's like a career goal, then I would say, again, right now, the way to get into the career is to complete your undergraduate degree and go get your master's degree. There are programs that hire people with their bachelor's degree, but we always encourage master's degree because there's more that you can do when you're doing crisis response. And again, that's the way our system is set up currently. I know there's places looking into how can we change that, because again, it's a huge, cost. A return on investment financially is not always great, right? And so it's a big precipitating factor in people going into the field. I think one thing that I always like when I have people ask me about my job who aren't in the field and have no interest in becoming a part of the field, I always say, go on a ride along. right? Like you as a community member have the right and the opportunity, as you know, as long as you fit within the police jurisdiction's policy, that you have the right to do a ride along. I think with Denver it's once a year. And that to me is like the most eye-opening thing in order to understand what it actually takes to do a crisis response, right? And I think we also have to understand that crisis is different for everyone. My crisis, it could be very different than anyone's crisis in the room, right? And my crisis may to someone feel smaller, but to me it's the biggest thing that's happening to me right now. Right? And so really putting it into perspective in that way, in terms of understanding crisis response. And I do actually think doing a ride along, you're able to see that, right? Why do people call 911? You know, I remember writing out for the person, someone's calling 911 for this? Like, are you serious? And then you actually go and talk to the person, you're like, oh, like this is causing you a lot of distress, right? And this is the number that has been ingrained in your brain, whether it was from family, community, TV show, you know, whatever the case, it's the only number you know how to access, the only number you remember, because I don't remember anyone's phone numbers anymore. That's why you're calling, because you're in distress, even though to me, I'm like, this feels small, right? And that is really humble to me in terms of my own crisis response of like, my crises are very different and it doesn't make my crises worse. We don't need to have a competition of who's worse, right? And so really understanding that. So furthering education if you want to go into the career, seeing if there's intern programs. We partner with MSU a lot. We're looking to revamp our intern program, so looking through the social work school. So seeing if there's intern programs, doing a ride along with officers, and then I think there's other opportunities to volunteer with people who could potentially have experienced trauma, you know, in a trauma-informed way, of course. You know, volunteer in different community spaces, so you're able to see how people have developed the coping skills they've developed, how they've been able to navigate the world based on their own experiences, whether it's nature or nurture, right? And how someone may get to a point of mental health crisis and how they've learned to deal with that, whether it's what we perceive as healthy or unhealthy. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. It just kind of depends on what facet and what path you want to take in terms of engaging in mental health crisis response. What I will say is that if you are having your own mental health crisis response, or you're engaging with someone who you think is having a mental health crisis response, and you don't feel equipped to handle it yourself for you, or you don't feel equipped to handle it for someone else, the best thing you can do is ask for help, right? That is like, we even tell our responders that, like, just because you are an acting expert, because you are the responder, doesn't always mean, like I used the example earlier, but who's going to build the rapport best? You can't always know everything, right? And so as you learn, you know, dealing with mental health crisis is humbling, and take that with you in every step. But that if it's your own crisis or someone else's, like the first thing we can do is say, if you can't handle it, reach out for help. And that is like the best thing in crisis response to remember.
Yeah, and while it's on my mind, on the note sheets, there's a QR code that actually goes to the Auraria Ride Along program. So I encourage everybody to look at that. Yeah. All right, so likely our last question before we get to Q&A. I'll start Chief Leonard by with all three of you. Looking ahead 5 years, what progress do you hope your field makes, and how can we, as an informed public, help avoid any potential pitfalls?
That's a tough one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because none of us know what the future is going to hold. The reality is, I think we're in a very hard place in society right now. One of our biggest detriments is social media. I look at my children, and I also teach for MSU Denver, and I talk with my students. And as a community, as a society, we're getting all of our information off of social media from others, right? We don't know their credentials. We don't know whether it's true or not. And the reality is, the algorithms they're now providing give you a confirmation bias, right? If you look for something, that's all you're going to get. If you want to know, I hate Taylor Swift. I don't, just saying. Everything you're going to get in the next 6 months is anti-Taylor Swift. I mean, it will literally feed you the exact opposite of what it should be feeding you. Because it doesn't help you open up to free thought when you're seeing the exact same information that's confirming whatever it is you believe, whether it's right or wrong. And I think as a society, we're so eager to break apart, look at fault in each other, and not understand that we are one community. We are one group of people that have each other's best interests at heart, I hope. And the reality is the failure of one is a failure of all. And if we're not willing to work together, if we're not willing to find what makes us a community and makes us, a family, and ultimately we're gonna find the things that make it harder for us to survive. So I think in 5 years, I would love it if we had a way, and our whole society found a way to be more supportive of each other and look for ways to better us as a community, not tear us apart.
In the next 5 years, I hope there are many more events like these. If I had to, if I had it my way. So we do have time for one more question, actually. That for the first time, I think this means we actually covered all the questions that I wrote. So I'm very happy about that. Again, for Chief Melinda, beyond events like these, what are the best ways for the public to learn accurate information about the fields? And what's one idea or assumption you would challenge people to think more critically about regarding mental health and or law enforcement?
So for one, I would recommend a ride-along info. So I'll say anything because the reality is most people have no idea what police do. You might see something or someone will tell you a story about how terrible the police were, but most good people only interact with the police if you're the victim of a crime, which is not a positive thing, or you get stopped for a traffic offense, also not a positive thing, right? You're not thanking the police officer for giving you a speeding ticket, even though you fully deserve it, right? Absolutely. As your friend, absolutely. And I think getting the proper information is so hard, again, because of all the things that we're inundated with. If you ever get bored, which I hope all of you do, just Googling how many police officers there are in the United States and how many contacts they make every day. Every single day, there are millions of police contacts in the United States. Very, very few are the ones you hear about on TV. They pick the very worst of the worst. And the reality is no profession is perfect. If you don't want to sleep tonight, Google how many people doctors kill every year.
If I can add to, when we have these dialogues, we have to think about, we're thinking about what the jobs are. We need to be critical of the systems. Like, why is it that there are, like when you're saying, like, oh, look at how many, and we could use more resources. So we're critical of the systems that are allowing things to go out and not providing the resources, but also be respectful of the people, right, doing the job. And so you can be critical, but also still respectful at the same time. And that goes for a lot of different things, right? We can disagree, but at the end of the day, you have to be okay with who you are and your own humanity and your own integrity. And so I don't sit here and say, oh, it's all those police officers' fault. Well, no, they don't make policy or laws. They don't decide funding. They don't decide who gets hired. It's the systems that allow it. And same with when we're looking at certain government programs and those types of things. Who creates laws? And how then do you impact who creates the laws?
I always tell people, just to pick up with that, like when, I'm a pretty real person, and so if I can't, I talk about the system and imperfections, plural, and when people tell me I should do more, I'm like, I have to follow along. I have to not only follow my code of ethics as a licensed political social worker, but I also have to follow the law. I will lose my license and potentially go to jail, right? And so if you want to make change, become a lobbyist. And they're like, what? And I'm like, that's what you do, right? Like, and I don't mean to sound harsh, right? But like I am doing this work and this is my specialty, and we need people who are challenging the system. I'm challenging the system this way. We need people who are challenging the system in a different way, and that equates to what you were just saying, looking at it from a larger picture and what systems have been created for us and how we can dismantle.
Perfect. So that ends all the prepared questions. Before we get to Q&A, I want to say I'm very grateful to our panelists again. This began as an experiment 3 years ago, and it's become something very core to my education here at MSU Denver. So I'm very, very thankful for your continued support. It's shown me how easy it is to become involved and make a tangible impact in one's community. And it is my sincere hope that everyone in attendance today finds their own community, which informs informs them of what they want to accomplish in life and how they can extend that gift to others, especially in times like this. So moving on to the Q&A section of the panel, I encourage everyone and anyone in person or online to express any thoughts they have, and yeah, anything goes. So please.
So I think you guys have kind of hit this a lot in like the last two questions, but with public sentiment being, and especially with you talking about the future of policing in the last 5 years or the next 5 years, what kind of positive developments have occurred in the last 5 years since the elephant in the room, George Floyd protests? I just like to get this elephant in the room off on a right foot.
I can tell you what we have done. So we started the co-response program April 1 of 2016 with Denver PD, so we're almost at 10 years, which is really long in this field. Since then, so since 2016 and since 2020, right, since the summer of 2020 with George Floyd, we have added co-responders to various departments. So we're not just saying in Denver, hey, police, you're the only people that contact individuals with mental health crisis, right? We've added co-responders with sheriffs because people experience an eviction or a certification pickup, which is mandated, your mandated treatment, right? Also need support, right? Please don't touch that in Denver. That's a civil issue, so it's sheriffs. When fire goes out to homes, they're contacting people who need medical support. If it's not criminal, police aren't showing up, so we're missing an entire population of individuals, right? And Parks and Rec, we're not always going into the park systems, right? Unless we get called because something criminal is happening or police need it, right? And so we added RTD, right? We're the first in the country to have co-responders in Parks and Rec. The park rangers were the first in the country, RTD, to have co-responders attached to that too, right? So it really is, we're really trying to affect change within and saying, how can we support community policing? How can we support education and reform, right? While we move towards a community that's providing mental health support to individuals who aren't accessing mental health support otherwise. And then we also created our alternative response model, right? The community said, and this was prior to George Floyd, the community said, hey, police aren't needed everywhere. And they're not, right? Like I'm sure you asked the chief, like there's calls that they go, we're not needed. We're not needed here. Why are we here, right? But it's a default. And so by providing, we don't. But by providing the right response at the right time for people, right? We're allowing people to trust a crisis response system. We're allowing people to build rapport over time. We're allowing people to say, hey, I've had trauma with X, Y, and Z responders. Maybe a different type of response is better, and vice versa, right? Again, I talked earlier about how some people bond with police versus mental health clinicians with trauma with the system. And so we're really trying to say, what does the community need when a police response isn't needed, right? And so that's where our alternative response model is. But again, like if we can show, like our numbers show that we're reducing use of forces, we're reducing tickets and citations, we're reducing arrests as well. And so we are reacting to a society and a community that said we want a different response.
The users use body cams, something that's fairly new. With the legislature mandated that they're pricey and there's a lot of management that has to go into it. So I'm not sure the police departments would naturally progress to that without that push from the people, right? Because you're better. Point. You're elected legislators that are creating the laws. And so having these is a huge benefit. Not because it makes officers act better, because it shows people what officers see. And the reality is the vast majority of officers are doing the right thing for the right reason. And that gets lost in translation because that doesn't make the news, right? The millions of calls are going on every day, not reporting it because it's not news. It's the ones that only go bad that they say, see, this is the example of why police are terrible and they're racist and they're murderers. But the reality is that's not true. And this is the way now that we can show the public what police officers do, how they're interacting with people, and how people are interacting with the police. Because when they're on the news later, they're very polite and they're saying how horrible the situation was, not really articulating that they were the problem, which is why the police were called in the first place. So it really does give I think, unbiased account of what's happening, and it lets people see, you know what, that's what the police are dealing with.
That's it.
I wanted to ask if it's all right if I talk about this a little bit for true about protesters, talking about this in the context of protest, about 3% of short flow protests, Black Lives Matter protests were violent, but the public overwhelmingly believes that the majority of those protests were violent, right? So we have to think about ways to actively cultivate media image both of the police and the people the kids are engaging with to dispel this kind of perception that violence is the norm and captured both on the side of, protesters and on the side of the police.
Yeah, and say, like, thinking about the broader field of criminology, and I think this is to Dr. Fatima point, there's the researchers that have come out with, like, kind of guidance, on, like, former police officers who are now faculty members, researchers, on, like, how to manage protests and providing more, peer-reviewed journals and articles on, like, how can we kind of move that field forward. And our academies, like within the field of criminology, have created more spaces to bring practitioners and academics together. So, for example, our American Society of Criminology has been largely, quite frankly, stuffy academics that have never been out in the field. And now we're going in and we're seeing even more people who used to be practitioners and then coming into the field and getting their doctorate degrees and working alongside each other. So we're opening up dialogue. And what can we do, and thinking about more like actual interventions and like implement programs that are able to be implemented in different spaces, and finding more progressive police chiefs who want to work with each other. So like we're making these strides within the field, so it's no longer just faculty sitting in their ivory towers reading their books, talking. And I will be the first to criticize faculty members. But I will also say, when I did taser projects, I was the first to also volunteer to be tased. So, we're out there sometimes.
Any other questions? Yes. Yes.
Oh, there's an ask. There's 100% an ask. Yes, we advocate for our financial backing often. I think mental health is a challenging field. It holds a lot of stigma. Still, we're starting to talk about it more and more and more, but funding is decreasing. It looks like it's increasing in some spaces, it's decreasing a lot in other spaces. Funding overall, right, in terms of like, I'm sure you see in the news, like funding in the state is a little challenging, right? The job costs money. It doesn't necessarily produce money, right? This is just Sam's opinion. I also think like it's challenging, to understand the effectiveness of prevention programs and intervention, because it would be a very long-term study, which would be costly. And so there doesn't seem to be a ton of financial backing in this field, and we advocate all the time, myself included, my staff, of increased pay. And I think people go into this field because they're passionate and they understand the mission and the value of the work that we do. And I think people are very aware of the financial space they will be in when they go in this field, and are okay with it because of the passion for the mission and the value of the work that they're doing. And so, yeah, it's a challenging space, but we do advocate often for it. And again, we don't do this work for money. Do this work because we genuinely care and want to better individuals, community, society, etc.
On that note, it's a pretty long and expensive road to licensure. I'm curious on your opinion on decreasing the length of time and the amount of schooling to be a part of a co-response team. Is that too dangerous?
It's not that it's dangerous. Great question. It's not that it's dangerous. So in the state of Colorado, in order to abide by the 2765 statute, and part of it is placing someone in a mental health hold and being able to appropriately assess for that, meaning are they at imminent risk of hurting themselves, others are greatly disabled, and if they are, they meet criteria for an M1, which means I'm signing off saying I'm taking your rights away, which is a big deal, right? And I'm taking the hospital a higher level of care because I don't think you're safe to be in the community at this point, right? And in order to do that, you need a license. That's how the state has it set up right now. And there, police officers can do it, doctors can do it, there's professions that can do it, but in terms of like the mental health field, licensed clinicians, LPC, LMSW, LAC, LMFT, all the L's, are the ones that are able to do that. And so when we think about in Denver, again, every community is different, but when we think about it, we do a lot of M1 assessments, right? And in order for me to like feel, we think about liability, but we also think about training, right? In terms of who's the most appropriate person to do that assessment. And that's how the training has been. In the state of Colorado is someone with that licensure. At the agency I work with, which I'm really appreciative of, is we do that supervision in-house. So if someone is working towards licensure, we're able to provide that at no cost to our clinicians and during work hours, which is really beneficial because it is quite expensive. And so we really get people who are working towards it, and then they're highly supervised. And so now that people aren't going into this field as much, we're not seeing as many licensed clinicians wanting to be in the community. We do think about how can we, is it possible to say someone doesn't need to be licensed to be a co-responder, right? There are many communities that don't hire licensed people. That's just what's worked for Denver. And we've scaled back a little bit just because of the workforce. But that is a requirement to do that assessment. And so that's important. I went to a conference in September and had to leave the presentation early, which is a bummer. But there was a group of, I believe it was MSU, I could be wrong, so don't quote me on a video or anything here, but they're looking at like, are there other ways to achieve the same capacity, right? Like people have advocated in the co-responder field, like can co-responders who are actively practicing as a co-responder be able to do that assessment, right? And have the backing of the law to say they are appropriately doing that assessment. Is there a certificate option or an apprenticeship option versus all of this really expensive and time-consuming, formal education? So I think people are starting to rethink it. But yes, long story long.
I don't see any questions in the chat. Is there anybody have any questions or comments, anything? All right, perfect. Well, I do want to be respectful of our panel's time, so we will conclude this event. I do want to thank everybody for their participation and participation for the last 3 years now, which is a little crazy to say.
I thought it was like,
Yeah, exactly. I also do want to thank Sebastian, as well as the entirety of the Delta Gamma G Criminal Justice Honor Society. They made a very great flattener and were very supportive of this event, so this would not be as put together as it is without them, as well as Amy and the entirety of the Clinical Counseling Club, because they gave really important feedback from the past couple of events. So very grateful for everybody, and I will be around for a little while longer for anybody who wants to get a little more involved in events like these, or if anyone's wondering how AI will change the government in the next 5 years. Because that's what I'm currently working on. Yes.
thank you.
Also, before you leave, can I get a picture?
Like any program.
Yeah.
Can I get the rest of it?
Oh, yes, of course. Yes.
We'll be back.
The last couple of years,